Good morning, afternoon, evening, and welcome to Concerned Citizens Presents, a new offering on Village TV. Concerned Citizens of Laguna Woods is an organization committed to peace, social justice, economic equality, and a clean environment. For the duration of the lockdown, instead of its usual 2 meetings a month, Concerned Citizens will broadcast 2 programs a month on this channel. Our programs will feature films, lectures, and debates on topics related to our mission. We hope you enjoy today's program.
Welcome to Concerned Citizens Presents. My name is Suzanne Modell, and I am chair of the Concerned Citizens Program Committee, the people who plan these broadcasts. Today, I'm going to have a conversation with a leading journalist about the future of newspapers. They are disappearing, along with other print products like weekly news magazines and monthly periodicals. Before delving into this problem, I'd like to introduce the expert who will help us understand the decline of newspapers. Rosemary Armao teaches journalism at the University of Albany and is a regular participant in current events programming on WAMC, the public radio station for the Capital Region, which is Albany, New York. For about 15 years, I have been listening to her commentary on The Media Project, a WAMC radio program, and luckily for me, a podcast devoted to the state of American journalism. Welcome, Rosemary Armao. Could you tell us a little about how and why you got into journalism?
Thank you very much, first of all, for involving me in this conversation. I'm always happy to talk about the media, and I have to say I'm always kind of amazed at the interest that people not in the field still seem to have in it. So this is really going to be fun for me. I knew in the 6th grade that I wanted to be a journalist. It was nothing highfalutin. It was a teacher that I adored. Teachers have such a big influence on us. And she said, "You are such a wonderful writer. You should go into reporting." Unfortunately, she did not say that to me. She said that to another girl in the class. I was consumed with jealousy, and therefore envy got me into journalism. But she was right. I do love the field, and I went into it for college studies. I went to Syracuse University. I always worked in journalism from the minute I graduated from Syracuse. I worked briefly for the hometown newspaper here in Albany, New York, a paper out of business now, apropos to this conversation, the Knickerbocker News. And then I went into the wire services, working for UPI, another company that has gone out of business, a media company that is no longer, was a competitor to the Associated Press. And from there, I worked in a number of newspapers, all the time also teaching. I always combined part-time teaching with working for newspapers. And then I got fired. I got fired from a newspaper in Sarasota, Florida for what they called an ethical violation. We obviously didn't see it the same way. And then I took a fellowship. And I went to Africa, and I worked as a coach in Uganda for almost a year. I thought it would be like a break from, the horror that my career had become at the time, and I'd come back and pick up where I was, but I never really did. I went from Uganda to Bosnia in Eastern Europe and worked with reporters there. So I moved, if you will, from editing and coaching into media development. That's what we did there. And I did that for a number of years. I probably might still be doing that. I did it on my vacations and part-time, but I did come back to Albany because my mother lives here and I live with her now. She's elderly, so we live together. And I teach and I work on the radio station and talk about the media whenever I can. And I'm trying to do some writing. And that's about it. Journalism has been extremely good to me. I've traveled all over the world teaching and training and writing. And it has been endlessly interesting. Every day is different. I wish I could convince more bright, smart, young people to get into the field like I did. We're losing them. It's one of the side effects of what we're going to be talking about today. Media still is in the mind of many people, print, even though that's really an out-of-date notion. And newspapers are dying. They are dinosaurs. They never did pay well, but now it's crazy. And so the brightest young people who used to want to go into journalism, like me, we thought we were going to change the world, and it was exciting and glamorous. The Watergate stories and the movies that came out of that made journalism glamorous. That's not happening so much anymore. Even Spotlight, a movie that came out about the Boston Globe's reporting on pederast priest, when it came out, it was out of date. The newspapers were already in decline at the time it came out. It seems dated. On the day it came out, it seemed dated to me. So it isn't drawing in the brightest young people the way it used to. And I worry about that because I think we in America especially need journalism.
I believe, from being a faithful listener of the Media Project, that Trump, however, has also had a kind of a bring attention to media and to newspapers, a positive effect, yes?
Trump, a positive effect? Oh, wow. I'm going to have trouble answering yes to that question. He has vilified the media. He has turned us into the enemy in the same way that Hitler did. And I that is an extreme comparison, and I make it on purpose. But both of them painted the media as fake, the fake news media. They're out to lie, and every mistake becomes proof of a lie, when in fact a mistake is not the same as fake news, as a hoax news. And Trump simply called anything that he disagreed with, i.e. anything that was negative about him, fake news. So it had a terrible effect on, I think, the public's perception of journalists.
But I'm talking more about circulation, Rosemary.
Yeah. Oh, I see what you mean. Absolutely. That, and I don't know if it was newspapers so much as television and online media, that Trump is a very visual and vocal person. So he did remarkable things for cable television, for example. CNN and MSNBC and Fox News have never had such great years. And also he inspired some absolutely stunning investigative reporting by the big newspapers of the world, the Guardian, as well as, of course, the Washington Post and the New York Times. He's you're right, that's an ironic effect, because he certainly is no champion of the press, and yet covering him made for something of a golden age for journalism, which was tampered, we have to mention this too, by the pandemic. Newspapers have been just brutalized by the pandemic. They have not been able to conduct news gathering in the same way. Newsrooms have shut down. Lots of places have closed or reduced publication. It's been one more blow and a series of economic hits on newspapers.
Right. Okay. So thanks for sharing a bit about your background, and also about, we might say, the ups and downs, mostly downs, of the attraction of going into journalism. But the fact is that most Americans are not aware of the decline of newspapers, which is one of the main reasons I wanted you to speak to us. A recent poll by the Pew Center, for example, found that 70% of respondents thought newspapers are doing fine, even though only 15% of them reported subscribing to either a print or an online newspaper.
Yeah.
So I'm going to start by providing 2 or 3 facts about print journalism, just to put what we've already been saying into a statistical context. And then I will ask you to comment on the causes, the consequences, and the possible solutions to this disturbing crisis. Okay, between 1987 and 2018, newspaper readership dropped from 62 million to 30 million. That's nearly a 50% drop during a time when the US population grew by about a third. Paid digital subscriptions have picked up some of this decline, A rough estimate is that in a given month, about 12 million Americans have digital subscriptions. So you can see that line of circulation is growing, but it's not growing fast enough. And then, of course, as you've already mentioned, the figures show that in about the last 12 years, the number of employees in journalism has dropped about half. So, with that introduction, Rosemary, could we begin by your identifying some of the causes of the decline in print readership?
Sure. I love that Pew study that you cited. Everybody sees news or hears news or talks with friends about it every day. So the idea that it's in any kind of trouble just seems crazy to them. But there's a certain magical thinking that Americans have, like your garbage gets picked up every week, right? You just put the barrels out and the guy comes. But what do you mean your taxes are going up? Because you forget about the money to drive those trucks, to maintain those trucks, to open up the landfills and maintain those, to fill it. We just think it's all automatic. It's the same, really the same sort of thing with news. And it has been on the decline for, I think you're right. You went back to the early, the late 1800s. And at that time, though, newspapers were it. It was print, or there was no other way to find out anything. Newspapers and then magazines, of course, but I'll put those in the same sort of category. That's no longer the case. There is a plethora of news sources right now that we didn't have. You don't need one mass media. You have print and broadcast, and the internet, of course, is the big new one. And you even have radio, which I'm interested in. And one has never died out. Print never was killed by broadcast, and internet hasn't killed either of them. But they've all changed, and the roles of all of them have changed. And not one of them commands now the mass audience over 50%. It's very hard to hold that. TV network news, the same thing. It used to be 3 TV stations. If you wanted news, you turned in at 6, at 11, and you got it from a limited number of places. Well, you don't do that now. We have news 24/7. It comes from CNN. It comes from online sources. We're inundated with news. The problem is not getting out the news, not distributing it, but gathering the news. And that's where the decline in jobs is. So you have places like Amazon and Google, especially Amazon, I'll say Facebook and Twitter, who have tremendous amounts. They are great sources of news, but they don't do any of the gathering. They simply, and this is, I use this word knowingly also, they steal it from the publications that do the collection. So New York Times reporting doesn't appear just in the New York Times, it appears all over the internet now. The same with local media. Local news is only collected by the Times Union in Albany. Name your local newspaper. That's the one where there are reporters on the ground, going to meetings, talking to local officials, keeping an eye on what officials are doing and how institutions are running. That's not being done by Amazon. They'll print it. You find a big story in Albany, it'll be on Amazon. There was a murder in Albany just yesterday. I can find that in all kinds of publications online, but only one place actually sent the reporters down to talk to witnesses, to talk to police. And that is what's not being supported anymore.
Well, Rosemary, can you explain kind of the legal structure? This is a question I've had for a really long time, that anyone can simply take, there's no copyright, there's no proprietary, they can simply recycle and they're without cost. I don't understand that.
Well, that's actually an excellent question. And if you look, when this first was becoming an issue in the 60s and 70s, you would see on the top of newspapers copyrighted. The little copyright symbol that we all know, that would be on, and yet newspapers are meant to be distributed. We want you talking about, hey, did you see what was in the paper today? That's the whole essence of journalism, right? And we teach our young reporters that if you didn't get a story, you pick it up from another paper. You cite them, of course, you have to do it ethically, as the Tribune reported today, and you use them. So how do you protect information that the whole purpose of it is to distribute it? And when the internet first came on board, newspapers struggled with this. Are we going to give away our content? No, we have to make people pay for this. But the thinking then was, no, you show people what you have, and of course, then they'll come to your site because they want more. And I don't know. I used to believe that. I don't know if I do anymore. Um,
Well,
Newspapers.
there's a difference, isn't there a difference between somebody consuming the news for their personal information and somebody using the news to make profits for their own organization?
Well, we'd like to think so, but they call themselves aggregators. And aggregation is a legitimate business model for many of these. Huffington Post, for example, doesn't pay anybody, and they collect information. They might add to it, but usually volunteer help. And so, yeah, their raw material is free, whereas newspapers competing with them have to pay the reporters, pay the photographers, pay for equipment. And so there is no competition, and that's how they won. Now, one of the hopeful things, I'm going to jump a little bit out of your order here, Suzanne, because you want to talk for cures at the end, but there is hope coming out of Australia these days, where the Murdoch papers have won a lawsuit that would require the aggregators, Amazon, and perhaps Google too will get in on this, to pay a certain small percentage for news that it takes from the Rupert Murdoch newspapers. That's a fantastic model, and it would allow, of course, some of the cost of news gathering to be borne by the organization making the profit. The same could be done here, or alternatively, if they were going to spend money for news gathering, you would have reporters being hired by the Amazons, Googles, and name them, Twitters of the world, and they would do original reporting. I'm fine with that. I'm not wedded. I don't think any real newspaper person is to actual paper. It's great to get rid of those big bolts of paper that cut down forests and left ink on your hands. Everybody used to complain about that, if you remember. So fine, put it online. That's no problem at all. But it's the cost of news gathering and how that gets paid for that is the issue. So that's again, that was a league. You asked about legalities. That is what Murdoch argued, that look, this is theft. This is just stealing my material, and you need to pay it. And they actually have acknowledged that this is true. Right. And there's one other thing, if I can just add to this. I spoke about we're losing good people in the field. Well, that's going to hurt everybody eventually. There will be nothing to aggregate if we lose journalists at the lower level, right?
Well, it's a paradoxical thing that humans engage in. They overfish their fishing grounds, and then they don't have any fish anymore.
You're exactly right. Good metaphor.
Yeah. So, but unfortunately, in the main, we have a lot of difficulty kind of working out the dynamics. The power dynamics are unequal in those situations. So usually the strongest wins. Yes. Let me just. This is very, very useful, what we've talked about so far. There's another dimension to the decline, another set of causes that I'd like to have you address before we move further, and that has to do with advertising.
Yeah.
Could you tell us what's happened with respect to advertising in the context of the news, the switch to particularly the internet?
Yeah, wow. I lived through this. I lost my first love. The newspapers, as I know them, that industry doesn't exist anymore. And it's far more from the business models of newspapers and how that changed than to any of there's differences in news philosophy now and the whole internet phenomena. You're absolutely right. It has to do with money. So here's how newspapers used to make money in their heyday. They would have subscribers, but that was really a small part of it. Your real money came from advertisers, big advertisers. Auto dealers were huge. Supermarkets were huge. The stores that used to line Central Avenue were huge. And they were big advertisers. And when newspapers, local newspapers, were the only medium in town, they got all the business. And then you saw a whole number of pressures on that. First, the stores gave way to the bigger stores. Walmart shut down how many of the local businesses? And that meant instead of 50 advertisers, you had one. And that was auto dealers did the same thing. They consolidated their mergers. Anytime there's a business merger, newspapers lost business. And then they realized that they could do mailers instead of what it used to be was they'd buy space in the newspaper, and the leftover space was always news. So the more ads you had, the more space for news there was. Then they went to those mailers, those annoying things when you open your paper and all the pages fall out, the color advertisements. Well, that was still some money for newspapers, but they lost money on that, because that was that's why the advertisers switched to that. It was an easier way for them to put out lots of advertising.
I'm sorry. Why was that a loss? I don't.
Because they were just printing. They would print these flyers and then pay the newspaper a certain amount to insert them into their newspaper. Whereas before they were buying actual space in the newspaper. It was set. The price was set by the newspaper, and it was high. And the cost of newsprint, the more ads there were, the more paper you used, costs went up, and that's how you paid for news. So they lost that. That was another step. Then a big, huge hit was the loss of advertising, the help wanted ads, those little tiny penny ads, all went to Craigslist. Remember when Craigslist came out? And it was online little ads, and people loved it. It was immensely popular. The founder of Craigslist, Craig Newhart, has actually become a philanthropist, donating to print media, because he realizes his role in the demise of print media. They lost so much revenue from that. Huge amounts of revenue were lost when those help wanted and pets for sale and garage sale notices, all those little tiny ads, which some of your younger listeners may not even know what I'm talking about, but they were the bread and butter of newspapers, and they're now all online. You don't see those things in the newspaper anymore. Huge loss of business. And in fact, newspapers have never replaced that. There is no business model that has replaced the loss of those things. It's just gotten worse and worse. You can look for real estate was another giant section of newspapers. Well, you don't do that now. You go to Zillow, right? It's all moved. The sale of these businesses, the operations of those businesses have moved online, and every one of those has represented a loss in revenue for newspapers. And then the newspapers themselves became big business. I think you and I have talked about this. We've talked about how there are fewer and fewer owners of newspapers. And what they are big businesses. They used to be just a big business that only ran news, like Gannett or the Tribune Company. Well, now they're being sold to hedge funds. The Tribune Company was just sold to a hedge fund. And every one of those requires that the newspaper run like a regular business. That means the old idea that we have a public trust. Sometimes we have to do things that are just for the good of the community, and we're not going to make money on it. Well, you don't do that with Wall Street. I blame the Gannett Company for this and the opening of USA Today. And they were the first ones until USA Today, Suzanne. Papers made a lot of money most of the time. But if there was an economic downturn, people held back their business ads, the newspapers would lose a little money because they were reflected the business in the community. But Newhart said, no, we can make money all the time. And he taught Wall Street that whether business was good or bad, you could continue to make a profit and it could continue to increase.
Who was this? Who?
It's the Gannett newspaper did this. And when it started USA Today.
Also it was a national paper. Did it not also get kind of subsidized because motel owners or restaurants or whatever would subscribe and then it was national, so it could sell, in Montana or Texas.
Absolutely. And that was the whole start. That was Wall Street woke up to the idea that we can make money from newspapers all the time, whether there's a good economy or a bad economy. We make it national or statewide, rather regional, something bigger than local, and then you can continue to have growing profits year after year. And that's what I think that really killed newspapers, because if you couldn't keep selling more and more advertising, how did you make your bigger profits? You laid off people, you cut back on newsprint, you cut product, which was what people were buying. And through all this time, I can remember papers would reduce the size. Papers used to be this big, now they're this big, right? If you look at a newspaper now from the 1960s, I've been digitizing some family photos, and there's old newspaper sections that I saved. They look enormous to me. They were shrinking, and all the time the newspaper owners are saying duplicitously to its readers, "Oh no, we're getting smaller, but we're working more efficiently. It's getting better." And the readers know better. It was not getting better. You were losing size. Stories were getting shorter. Obits no longer were unpaid. Obits are very important local news. They're history. And most newspapers, you have to pay, right, by the word. And I mean, that is not an increase in service. That's not as good as it used to be. We lied to people about it, I think. So you were annoying the people who still loved your product and not putting out anything daring or great, like, "Oh, we have to really compete. We're in trouble. Let's go crazy now and do something really wild to bring in people." Instead, they got more and more careful. So as cost cutting continued, you'd stop investigative reporting because, first of all, it's really expensive and it's dangerous. If you get sued, you lose all your profit. We don't want that. We'll write nice news, no anonymous sources. Oh, God forbid. That could get you into trouble. So the news got blander. And you see it, you see it on cable TV too, but it's in newspapers too. Now it's all opinion. The aggregators don't really print news or investigations. They print opinions about news that's written elsewhere. It's not good. I don't blame a lot of people for not reading it. It's just not as good as it used to be. And I don't mean to make it sound that in the 60s and 70s and 80s, this was like some fabulous, unendingly great journalism every day. But I do think there was a lot more of it than now, with the exception of the national publications, which are doing just fine. The New York Times and the Washington Post are doing very well. The Guardian, well, they're hurting for money. So we're all looking for money in different ways now. But the business, there's not been a replacement of the old sell the want ads, sell the big advertisers. There's been no replacement of that. You mentioned digital membership, but subscribers never paid for the bulk of journalism. And
let's hold off on that. Let's go
Okay.
to digital in a second. I'd like you
Sorry.
still to tell us a little bit more about the hedge funds. You see here, we're broadcasting from Laguna Woods Village, which is a retirement community of about 20,000 people. And we have a local paper called the Laguna Woods Globe that comes every Thursday, which since many of us are not so digitally apt, we are wedded to. I can't tell you, it is the major forum of communication in this community. And it is a subsidiary of, the Orange County Register. Which a few years ago was purchased by some subsidiary of Alden Capital, which is a hedge fund. And we have already seen cost cutting on our local paper. We've gone through several editors as things have gotten tighter, and we've noticed fewer stories about the village and more about they're importing stories from the larger paper. I don't like to say this to my neighbors, but I don't know that the Laguna Woods Globe has long life ahead. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about this process. What is it that gets these hedge funds in this business? And then they're really not in the business because they end up stripping the papers of their assets and selling whatever remains and going bankrupt and all kinds of financial unscrupulous manipulation. So could you talk about that a little?
Well, I think you just said it. I told you that I worked in Eastern Europe. And so there we watched as countries that used to be socialist or communist began churning over into a Western style of an economy. And all of these big state-run companies were privatized. They were sold off. And time after time, we saw the same thing. They weren't hedge funds, they were other companies, but they did the exact same thing. They would buy the company that was maybe not in trouble, but the state certainly was in no position to run it anymore. And they would buy it, get a good price, promise to put tons of money in to change it. And then they systematically strip away all of the assets. So you will see that the papers will get smaller. They might become more infrequent. The expensive older reporters will be replaced by young people who don't know anything and won't cause any kind of trouble, won't complain about the lousy journalism they're going to see. There'll be fewer local stories because you'll have fewer reporters overall. That's a hallmark of all of these, that fewer reporters are on the scene. And that's where you're really losing quality. That's where you're rubbing against democracy, because there are more and more communities that are going without oversight, without professional journalistic oversight. And it's meanwhile, the newspapers, newspapers, even in the time I was talking about, they always made money. They just didn't make enough money. The Gannett model was, we are going to make this much profit now, and every quarter we will make more of the profit. So it had to constantly be increasing. But there was never a point where like, oh, we're going broke. So it's a great deal for the hedge funds. They buy into a money-making operation, strip it bare, run all the assets out, and then when they're done with it, that's it. And what do they don't care about that. They don't care about the loss of a community arbitrator. They don't care about the loss of a government oversight. And readers increasingly don't seem to care either. I don't think they're aware. It makes me worried. It's not like we read less, people read books and they're on their screens. And what are they reading on their computers, on their little phones all day like this? What they're reading, people read, but they're not reading about their local communities. They're not reading even a lot of the national news. And hedge funds don't care about this at all. They are strictly business machines, and they're out to make money.
Okay, I guess maybe there isn't much to say about it. It's kind of like, I don't understand why newspapers aren't paid for their content, and I don't understand why something isn't done about hedge fund ownership of news, which is like, it's like a public utility. We have to have it. It's not something we can live without. It's not something that adapts to the profit model. But obviously, I'm an old lady, and I'm not thinking straight.
So idealistic, Suzanne. So we just saw this with the Tribune. That a hedge fund wanted to buy it. The employee said, "No, give it to us. We'll pay you for it." They had a local backer who was going to give them money, and we'll run it. We'll run it like a newspaper. And the company decided, no, we're going to sell it to the hedge fund because the hedge fund has money. It could offer more money. It's all business. And we grew up, and you and I grew up in an age where newspapers, where the media was supposed to be a public trust, that we had a goal that was beyond just, we had to stay in business and make money, and we did, but we had something bigger, and that's gone now. That's completely gone as far as I can see. In most places. Okay,
let's back up to, I had interrupted you before you had started talking a little bit about digital subscription. So what's the story there, and how many papers are actually doing it, and how successful is it working?
Well, I think in your intro, you gave an idea for that. There were some missteps, whether newspapers should give away content or invite in readers, and they all set up the paywalls. You've heard that term, the paywall. And that's been relatively a new thing. Up until just a few years ago, newspapers tried to give away their content. And the idea was, you read a little bit and then you'll want more. So you'll come in and read more and more, and you'll pay our ads. It was sort of like digitizing the old business model. That did not work. It did not work. People don't want to pay anything. It's the magical thinking. If you can just call it up on your computer screen, why are you paying for it? It's free. It's right there, right? So they were not getting enough membership. So then they put up paywalls in order to get in. You could read a certain amount. You could read the headlines, for example, for free. But then if you wanted to read anything more, you have to pay an amount. That doesn't work because people found you don't need that either. Like, I do that myself. I try not to, because I try to support newspapers. But if I'm looking for a story, if I want to look for Laguna Beach, I'll go to the Orange County Register and I'll see what I can get for free. And if I can't get it there, I'll try Los Angeles. I'll try the local TV and radio station. And you frequently can get information. There's ways around paywalls, and that's what people do. So no one, with the one exception that I know about, and that, again, I'm not an expert in this, is the Wall Street Journal. And that is such specialized, highly desirable, high quality information that they have been able to sustain themselves with a very large, and from the beginning, with a large digital subscribership. The New York Times, the Washington Post, they have done well with political coverage. And that's the Trump effect you were talking about. There was such appetite for information about, oh my gosh, what's he doing now? That they also have seen increases in their digital subscribership. But it has not been the redemption that we would have hoped for.
Right. I also just might mention one of the statistics that I picked up when I was researching this conversation is that the average amount of time that a digital subscriber spends, per shot on the website is 2 minutes. Yeah. So I do think another possible consequence, it's not simply of digital subscription, but of the general idea of consuming news digitally, it has to do with the depth. And so maybe what we should do is move on to consequences, the depth that given the demise of newspapers, what are the repercussions of that in terms of our ability to really understand what's going on?
We don't understand. And you know this, and I really am going to sound like a dinosaur here, but you know that my main interest is investigative reporting. Investigative reporting has never been the mainstay of any publication. Okay, never. You would have, it grew up in the big newspapers, the metropolitan newspapers of the late 1800s, which were big newspapers, filled with comics. People love comics. Filled with sports. People love sports. Filled with local advertisement that you couldn't get anyplace else. And oh, by the way, while you're flipping through the pages looking for all of that, there would be a big investigation about corruption in the metropolitan transportation system. But nobody is going to go on the internet and say, show me everything about corruption in the city of Albany. Yeah, no one looks for that. So where's the home for that now? Where's the home for that now? There are books about national and international topics, and there are magazines, and there's TV that's picked up a lot. There are citizen journalists. That was supposed to be our savior at some point, right? That you know what's happening in your school board. But, it doesn't work. If somebody were to die in the house next door, would I really go and say, my neighbors need to know about this dead person? How did they die? Oh, well, I'm going to check the police reports. I'm going to do all the reporting of a reporter. But no, I have to work. I have a job. I don't have the time to do it. So we've lost all of information on every level, has no home anymore. I worry about that all the time. And as far as, that's my famous cuckoo clock. I don't think it's saying that what I'm saying is cuckoo. I think that's just a mistake. The other thing that goes along with that is the whole process of government. We don't know anymore. Now, that's not all media. A lot of it is schools where we don't teach civics in the way we did when we were kids. But, how does a bill become a law? Can my granddaughter tell me that the way my children could? I'm not so sure that she can, because who's teaching her? When Trump said, Mr. Pence, he can say this, he can still give me this election by not certifying. Did we know what that was all about? Certifying elections? Did you ever even hear of that? And where are you gonna read about that or hear about that if not in the news? Where does that information come from? There is no one now without newspapers watching what government officials are doing. Several years ago, in the 1990s it was, so it's a while back when this trend was starting, the LA Times won a Pulitzer Prize for investigative reporting in a local community called Bell. You may know where that is. And what they did, it was outrageous. The officials in the city council voted themselves raises. They had all these perks for which they were doing nothing. It was just out and out corruption. And the LA Times bared it all. It was actually relatively easy reporting. The problem was it should never have happened. If there had been regular coverage of the Bell community, that would have been caught, or they would not even have tried it. But without the oversight of the press, it just doesn't happen. Come on. Without the oversight of the press, how about the SEC violations? How about Paul Manafort? Why was he breaking the law for decades before anything happened to him? Well, because nobody in business, nobody in law enforcement does it. It was the media's job to find that. And when it finally did, when he became a Trump campaign manager and his excesses became a matter of public interest to the newspapers, then something happens about it. Many of our institutions depend on the investigation and oversight of news, and it's going away. That's a huge consequence. And everything pales in comparison to that. We are less involved in government. You could talk about civic involvement. Again, the media is not the only institution responsible. Women work now. We have a chance to go into the workplace and make a difference and make money. So we're not volunteering. The women volunteers who ran all the civic organizations for decades in this country, women, ladies of the club, that famous book, that's gone away too. But still, without newspapers saying this is needed in your local community, you could do this, send money to the, how does that ever happen? We don't really have replacements for this stuff now. So I think those are the worst consequences. Can you think of more? Are you thinking, do you have more in mind when you asked me this question?
Well, one of the other things that came to my mind was political polarization. That there's been more, sort of niche news. People are getting, they're not getting the truth because they're watching
their own. Yeah.
Right. And I don't know if that's related to the demise of newspapers at all, but it's certainly the number of TV. We have Sinclair and we have Fox, and I don't know how many millions of people are now digesting information that's incorrect.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. It's a little complicated. In the United States in the 1800s, newspapers, that's all there were. There was not TV or radio then, of course, but they were very divided. They were liberal and conservative, Democrat or Republican, just like now. And you read either one or the other or both, just the way we have to now. And so are we more polarized than then? I'm not sure. It was a relatively short period of time, the 20th century, part of the 20th century, when you had these mass publications where you would get, the homogenized point of view or both points of view, the whole idea of objectivity. That was relatively short-lived in our history. So I don't know if it's the death of print that's caused it, but we certainly have gone back to that old model of niche and opinionated journalism, no objectivity, partisan stands. It certainly isn't healthy, but I'm not sure that it's exactly the same, related to the same thing.
Well, maybe, what you're saying is if you compare today with 100 years ago, then there's not so much difference. But if you actually look at the in our childhood or our adulthood, we had, for example, we had 3 TV networks, and we all watched Cronkite, or my father liked Howard K. Smith or whatever, but there wasn't a huge difference in the worlds that they were describing.
That's true.
And now that situation has changed, and the newspapers are not there to offer a corrective. I guess that's kind of what I'm thinking.
I see that point. I think that's absolutely true. And there's one other thing too, if I can move on a little bit, is that the celebrity news, the kind of pop culture, crap is the word I want to use. I don't know if that's allowable. Just, it's entertainment. It isn't really news. I mean, why do I know so much about Kim Kardashian? Come on. Why do I know so much about her? Or why if you look up, I get several news aggregators and consolidations on my smartphone, and it's there'll be the top 2 political stories, and then it's all entertainment stuff. It's personalities, what actress has done this and what singer has done this, and we're all going crazy now over the Gates divorce. Is that really literally news that we should be looking at? I mean, I'm interested in it too. I can't say I'm not guilty of it, but the decline of newspapers that had a finite amount of space to fill up, all the news that's fit to print, all the news that fits, part of it. We used to say that about the New York Times, but without that limitation, now we're getting all this other stuff and it's taken over. And of course, worse is that we can track now what every reader is looking at. Remember how I said the investigative reports were stuck in there along with sports and the horoscopes and the popular stuff. You didn't know, there was no way to figure out how many people were reading one and the other. Now we can tell how many clicks are on every story. And so what are you going to do if you want to make business because you're run by a hedge fund? You put in the stories that get the most clicks. Hence, read about the Gates and the Kardashians.
That's actually a really important point that we didn't talk about. There's a whole phenomenon now where if you are doing something digitally, anyone can track it. And so what that means is, first of all, as you just said, the newspapers, or they know, what is it you say on the media project? I know something about the broccoli and you make this compare, you're trying to get people, the news is the broccoli, and you're going to give people sweets in the hopes that they'll have a little broccoli.
Right.
But if you're strictly driven by a business model, then why not just give sugar every day? You certainly,
absolutely.
And
that increasingly has happened. There's and I've looked at print newspapers all over the world, and it's the trend. And it also is so cheap to produce. Kim Kardashian plays across the whole world. So you pick up a story, you pick up a story about her, and that fills up your space, and people read it, and you put your ads in. We're getting dumber. I think the media, one role of media always was to educate, and are we living up to that function anymore? Are we?
Well, you're still teaching, so I did want to ask you, as a professor, and you've been doing it for a long time. What's your sense about the change over time in terms of students' awareness of current events?
Dismal. Oh my gosh, Suzanne, dismal. These are, I mean, remember, I deal with students who are interested in journalism. That's the field that they have themselves selected. No one held a gun to their head and said, you will be a journalist. They picked it. And yet they've never read an investigative story. When they say journalism, they mean sports stories frequently, or reviews, music or gaming reviews. They do not mean news in the sense that I meant it, which was covering what your government was doing, covering what business was doing, figuring out in that budget, what does that mean for you as a taxpayer? They have no idea of this at all, none.
But you think it's worse? I mean, I'm talking now across time. I'm not. You might have said that 10 years ago. No.
Well, I'm trying to think about even myself. When I was in college, did I know all this stuff? No, definitely not. But I learned it soon after, and I'm not sure that's happening now. I don't think there's a market for it now. Do I really have to know how to read a municipal budget? Do I have to understand what a municipal bond is anymore to be a journalist? Not really. And if I don't know it myself, how can I explain it to anybody else? I have a pretty dismal view of where we're going with that.
When I was preparing for today, I did try, but I failed to find really adequately comparable examinations over time. You can find a lot of information about the fact that the public is ignorant, but in terms of the question of whether it's more or less ignorant, that's not clear to me that we really have a good sense of that. But what we do know in the present is that there is a relationship between people's knowledge of current events and their propensity to say that they get most of their news from their phone. And I don't have to tell you what that relationship looks like.
Exactly. I mean, on your phone, you get a headline. I get news on the phone. I don't knock it. But if I see a story that says, grand jury is studying charges against Trump, I immediately go to the New York Times online to get the real story. My students don't do that. And I find just a lack of interest in news. They're using their phone, but again, it's for sports and entertainment, news in the broader sense, not in the news where you live and politics and how life is changing and all deep issues. They're not reading that.
Well, that is disturbing. We could still kind of cross our fingers that maybe, as you say, as they age, as people age, and
Yes.
they have more investment, things that are going on in their community will affect how much taxes they pay and so forth. So
Exactly.
they may have a higher motivation. We have about 5 minutes left, I'm afraid. This has been a great conversation. Could we move finally, perhaps 5 minutes is all it needs,
What can be done?
solutions? What do you see, or are there? You did mention a little bit about the case in Australia. That's
Yes.
good news. What might be some ways, maybe not to save newspapers, but certainly to create an informed public?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to frame it, to create an informed public, which has been the traditional role of print media. What does that now? I do think the model of aggregators paying something for news they take will help. So would building their own independent, if you will, news gathering operations. We can't lose those investigators on the ground. Citizen journalism is fine, but it just is not the same as professional journalism. So I think that helps. I think that there are models too for government contribution to journalism. Britain has done that successfully for years. The BBC is a huge conglomerate that does, recently we're reading about bad things they've done, but they've done great work, important work, and it comes with a government subsidy. And they've managed to do that without getting hooked up with government regulation. You have to have an independent press. And how can you be independent if you're taking money from the government? So I think that model needs to be looked at seriously. I think that there are alternative forms of written journalism that are coming back. I'm very encouraged by newsletters, which Substack is an organization that has a series of newsletters. One is by Heather Richardson Cox. You may have heard the American. Oh, she's great.
Yeah,
I love her. She writes like little mini essays every single day, except I think she takes one day off a week. But they're fabulous. They're deep. They are digestible. They're wonderful. They're history and journalism, and that's good. Rev Smith, who went from being the editor of our local paper, is now writing a newsletter like that also for Substack. I think that's encouraging. I think online, we continue to see great work that can be supported directly by people who give money. ProPublica is one of the what do you call those things? They're business models built on nonprofit. They're nonprofit. They take donations from people and from foundations.
Well, actually, I just discovered this was a big article in the New York Review of Books that The Guardian, I didn't know,
Yeah.
I mean, which is just 200 years old now.
Right.
The Guardian is essentially run by some kind of very well-off nonprofit trust that doesn't.
Right. The St. Petersburg paper in Florida has been run by the Poynter Institute for years. ProPublica was set up with a huge endowment and run by former Wall Street Journal people. They do fantastic investigative reporting. I worked for years for the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. Same thing. Money came from foundations and from government, no strings attached grants, and they did independent, complex, hardcore investigations. I think those are certainly a model of what will save us in the future going forward. And I hope that the Trump era is that, I took some comfort in the Trump era. As media came under attack, you would see demonstrations in which people held up signs that said, support local journalists, journalists are heroes. And they began subscribing to local newspapers again. I think that's important. And while I have been overall gloomy in this talk, there are signs and there are many good people working on this. So I do think we'll see some, it won't all disappear.
Great.
We aren't doomed.
Well, Thank you so much. I really enjoyed talking with Rosemary, and that she would take time. She's a very, very busy woman, but she's really helped us to understand America's newspaper crisis. I would also say to the audience that if you would like to know more about the world of journalism, I encourage you to listen to the 25-minute podcast, The Media Project, which you can find on your tablet or phone by simply typing the words The Media Project, WAMC. Put that in any search engine. You don't really have to subscribe. It'll come up and you can click on the most recent episode, and there's always something fascinating to discuss. And Rosemary is there about half the time. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for your interest and for your really smart questions. I really enjoyed this, Suzanne.
All right. And we look forward to another episode of Concerned Citizens Presents next time.